Hello guys, I just wanted to make it a bit more explicit how this form stuff works. So I'm going to do the low level stuff and then we're going to build upon it. So what we're looking at here is the actual forms. Let's see, this shouldn't be there. Yeah, oh sorry, it should be there. So this is like the forms module and you attach it to the controller. And now you can pass it, as you can see here, you can pass it some custom rules. So the way this works is that you just attach them to this object. So I have a rule called min length, and all these rules are a function that receives some arguments. So it always receives a value and the form itself, so that you can compare this value to other values in the form. And then you can also get a third argument. As you can see here, min length and then colon and then 3. That will be the last argument. But this can actually be anything. So this could be is equal to, for example, apple pear, like that. So this is parsed as JSON. So the number 3 here will actually be received as a number over here. So that makes it kind of powerful. But the thing is, I have this extra rule defined here. So what we can do now is head into the example module. And what we're going to focus on first here is this form that I have created, form A. And we use this form instantiator, or what you would want to call it. And this takes the form, like the fields of the form. So we have one field there called name. And what this function does, or this instantiator, is to go through the form and validate it, because you might have some initial values in your form. And now we are doing it when we instantiate the module, but this you could do this in some action, for example. Maybe you have a signal where you mount a form, and then you could add the form to your state store by doing the same thing. But the point is you have to validate the initial form as well. And that is the way you do that. So what we're going to do now is add this. We are going to build the most low-level version of this form. So I have prepared some stuff here. Here we have the name. Okay, so what we can see at the top here is that I'm grabbing the form. So we have access to form A here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to say input, and the value of that input is going to be, I have form A and name and value. Okay, so I have the field is name, but its value is value. And let's try that first. If I save that, we do not see anything, but if I go in here and I type some text there, we see that it's updated. But we have to add an onChange handler here to do this correctly. So let's remove that and let's add an onChange handler. Okay, so onChange, we want the event here and we want to fire off signals.forms. Okay, so we do not point to, like, this is just state. If we want to manipulate that state, we have to use the actual forms module. As you can see here, we have forms, and that exposes some signals so that you can trigger, for example, forms input changed. So some input has changed and we have to tell it what input has actually changed. And we do that by pointing to the field, which is example form A and name. So that is the field that has changed, and the value we want to put there is target value. Okay, so let's see what happens now. When I click this now, we see that it fires off the signal and it does some different things to the field. First, it touches the field. So by default, the field has not been touched. And this is something you often need when you want to display messages. You want to know if the field has been touched or not to evaluate some message to be displayed, or for whatever other reason. But actually, if you have a value initially in the form, that also, or in the field, that also means that the field has been touched. So when I fire up now and we look at the model here, form A name, it is not touched. But if I add a value here and we look again, we can see that name has been touched. Okay. So let's remove it again. And what we see then is that it actually just updates the value. And then we figure out if it actually has a value. Because this is, like I said in the previous video, if you watch that, there's a difference between having a value depending on the field. So like an input, if you have a value in an input, it means that the string has a length. Because it's always a string there. But if it's the length is 0, it's not really a value. And like with a checkbox, that's different. When the checkbox is false, that means that the checkbox doesn't have a value. And you use has value to figure out if the field is required or not. So if you want to indicate a required indication or use a required indication, you check has value. If it does not have a value, then you can mark it as required. About touch field is different because you use that to, for example, I will show this later, that when you have some validation, you don't want to run that validation unless the field has been touched. So that means if you want an email and an empty string is not an email. But when you type something and it's wrong, and then you wipe out the input again, then you still want to show the validation message because the field has been touched. So that is an example of why you want that state. And then finally, it figures out if it should run the validation, but we don't have any validation rules, so it won't run. So maybe we can do something about that. So let's say validations is, let's see, let's use isEmail, which is the only one I have now, which just checks the @ sign. So let's do that. And when I type something now, we can see that it starts to validate and it's false. It's not valid. But as soon as I type in the @ sign, it's true. Okay. So what we can do now is actually insert a validation error. So error messages is also an array. So because you can have multiple validation rules, which I'm also going to show. So let's say invalid email, like that. And of course you want to use this. So the way we use this is by pointing to the field and just error message. So the current error message is on error message. And error messages is where you define the different error messages. Okay, so let's do that. And now it says invalid email. But as soon as I hit the @ sign, you see that it's removed. But the thing is that now we actually see the error message when we fire up the form, and we don't want to do that. So now we can start using our state, like is touched, then we allow to show it. So for example, now we don't see it now, but as soon as we type something, it appears. But if I go back and empty out the input, we still see it, and we want that to happen. Yes. So that's good. Did I want to show something more there? No, not really. So this is like the low level version. And you can use like input changed. Maybe it should be called something else like value updated. Yeah, I think I'll change that to make it more generic because you can create any kind of input element. And this is, of course, related to just updating a value. Or field updated might be good. Anyways, so that's like the low level version. But what we can do is uh, abstract it. So let's move this down here. And let's move this up here. And let's take a look at that one. So here we have an actual email, and we have an initial value, and we have two validation rules. So we require it to be a minimum length of 3, and then we check if it's an email. And then we have two different error messages here. So let me save this one too, and hopefully it works. And as we can see here, it indicates that it's invalid because it doesn't have the correct length. But as soon as it gets the correct length, it changes the validation. So now it says it's not a valid email, and I update again, and there we go. And so that is how you add more error messages and validation rules. And the good thing here is that the way it figures out the correct validation message is by looking into this array and matching it with the one that failed. But it actually sets the error message to error message here, which means that if you get maybe like a server response which has its own error message, not something that you can predict here, but it's just something wrong is happening, then you're free to insert something on this error message yourself, which is kind of nice. Okay, we also have, oh yes, of course. And what I also wanted to show you here is that I have abstracted an input field. So the logic we inserted mostly here is now inside this component. So we only need to point to the field, and if the field inside the state store has some validation rules, it will just run those validation rules. But I am still checking state here to display an error message. But we could abstract this again. So if I would, let's pretend we are inside the component now. Well, really, what I could do is, for example, here I could say this.props.label, for example, or field name. And then again, I could just say this.props.field. And then I would continue to use, so this component would like have its own decorator where I would go in here and I would extract the field by using, props.field like this. So I would create a component that uses Cerebral to extract the field so that I'm free to play around with that specific field. And then I would use other properties like a field name to create a header label, and I would display the errors any way I want. So the point is that we can keep on abstracting this, but we have this low-level API that lets us do anything we want, really. So let's remove all this stuff like that. And then we have, okay, so I just have different abstractions here for select and checkbox. And then we have this asynchronous thing where, well, I don't need to show that, do I? Okay, I can show it. Let's see. Let's let's just comment in everything again, like that. Okay, I think this is still working. So as we can see here is that we have added a couple of properties to this field, username is validating and is validated. And we have created a custom signal. So the forms module comes with some signals to update different kinds of fields, really. And then you can create your own signals if you want to update the values and the validation yourself. So since everything is just in the state store, you're free to just go in there and do whatever you want, really. So what we do here is that we grab the isValidating property from the field, and we also render a message. So we change the validation state of that field manually because we can do that. But the good thing is that this is still part of the form. We can still extract the field. We can synchronize the input values with the field itself. So when we trigger the signal, we can just grab the value of the field from the state store. So we got all the basics, but we have added some new functionality. And I think especially with asynchronous validation, we can implement generic asynchronous validation into a form library. It's different for every single project. But I think this is a really good balance. Like, okay, we do have this, we synchronize the field, the input field, like the value, but then we allow the user to hook up whatever they want, and they just go straight into the state store and change the valid state and all that stuff. So so when I blur, I check the name, and it just alternates on being valid or not. So I have a small endpoint doing this stuff. Okay, and when everything is okay here, invalid email, we see that the submit button opens up. Okay, I hope that gave some more insight into how you have these abstractions that you can add and how you can customize the inputs and the validation and all that stuff. So yeah, I'll just stop there.